All right. Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. And a huge thank you to joining us today for a discussion on the metrics you love to hate in 2024. The webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head over to the Lead Dev Slack to answer some of your questions in the hashtag Engineering Velocity channel. We may also have time to answer a couple of questions live, so please do submit any of those questions through the feature on Zoom, and we'll get them to when we can. So let's get started with some introductions. My name is Lima, and today I'll be joined by our wonderful panelists to share their experiences and insights. I'll ask each of you to introduce yourselves, starting with Nathan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Lima. It's good to see you again. My name is Nathan Harvey. I work at Google Cloud, and I work on a program called Dora. And maybe you know the Dora metrics. Maybe you love them. Maybe you hate them. I don't know. Let's talk about the Dora metrics. I lead up the team that is behind Dora. And of course, Dora is much more than just a set of 4 metrics. It's a big research program that's been running for over a decade. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks.
Thanks,
Hi,
Nathan. What about you?
everyone. Oh, thank you so much, Seema. Excited to be here as well. I am the SVP of engineering at Replicated. Before that, I worked with teams like Netlify and GitLab. I fell in love with engineering metrics a long time ago, probably about a decade, and I don't think I can work with a team without them. So I'm super excited to get the conversation going and, learn a lot from Nathan and Lima as well.
Awesome. It's going to be great. So let's get into it. The most important thing we do as leads is picking the right metrics, whether it's metrics for A/B tests or metrics for measuring team performance. Metrics can absolutely drive behavior, and poorly chosen ones can lead to gaming the system or prioritizing wrong things like shipping fast at the expense of quality. So knowing this is one of the hardest and most important things we do as engineering leads. What metrics do we want to keep? What metrics do we want to leave behind in the past year? We'll answer all those questions, but before we do, let's dive into it. Before we dive into it all, could we start by explaining what Dora and space really look like in practice, Nathan?
Yeah, for sure. I'd be happy to do so. So let's actually start with space, because space is actually a framework that will help teams identify ways to measure really any creative or complex work. It's not just for developer productivity. It can be really used for anything that's creative. And one of the most important things to remember about space is that it leans into this idea that you can't just use one metric. There is no one metric to rule them all. You really need sort of a constellation of metrics. On the other hand, space doesn't actually prescribe any metrics. Rather, space looks at dimensions or categories of metrics that you want to think about when you're trying to measure some creative work. So space itself is actually an acronym with each letter representing one of those dimensions or categories. And I'll just run through them really quickly. So S is satisfaction and well-being. P is performance. A is activity. C is communication and collaboration. And E is efficiency and flow. And so the authors of the space framework recommend choosing metrics from at least 3 of those dimensions when you're looking to figure out what metrics should we use. So let's take an example of space metrics and put them into practice. And let's say just randomly, we want to measure something like, I don't know, software delivery performance, a team's ability to deliver changes to a system safely and quickly. So if we think about that problem space and put it into sort of the space framework, we might start with something like efficiency and flow. How long does it take for a change to go from committed to version control all the way through to running in production? And maybe an activity metric might be how many deployments have you done in the last, I don't know, last quarter? A performance metric might be something like how long did it take to recover? An efficiency metric. How long did it take to recover from a failed deployment? A performance metric might be how many of those deployments failed in a way that required immediate rework. So there you go. You've got efficiency, flow, activity, performance. Actually, we have 2, efficiency and flow. But those 3 dimensions give us a way to look at how a team can safely deliver those changes to a system. As it turns out, and in a surprise maybe to no one, those also give us Dora's 4 software delivery performance metrics. You see, Dora is really an implementation of the space framework. But like I said, Dora is much more than that. It's a research program whose sort of center of gravity, if you will, is around software delivery performance. But the research looks into the conditions and the capabilities that are required for a team to have in order to drive those software delivery performance metrics.
That's really interesting. I actually just realized while you were explaining this, that so for context, I lead one of the engineering teams that's responsible for the experimentation practices and strategy on the homepage at Spotify.
Mhm.
So not the experiment platform team, but the team that is responsible for helping other teams run experiments on home. And I realized a lot of the metrics that you were talking about with regards to like successful deployments, and then how quickly does it take us to when a deployment fails, how do we fix that? How quickly can we fix that? We have the exact same things, but from an experimentation point of view. So like we monitor or we keep track of like the number of quote unquote successful A/B tests, and like how long does it take before we realize that we have to end an A/B test early because like it's not designed correctly, or like it's just not, it's never going to we're never going to answer the hypothesis that we think we would before we had set that up. So it's really interesting that it's like exactly the same, but different concept?
Yeah, and if I may, I just want to nitpick a little bit on the phrasing you use. You said a successful A/B test.
Right.
Knowing that you
Well,
have to
quote
turn it
unquote.
off, knowing
Right.
that you have to turn it off, that's success, right? You've
For sure.
proven that that was a bad hypothesis. So
Right,
good on
right.
you, right?
Yeah, definition of success is like it depends on who you're asking with when it comes to A/B tests. But fascinating. So, Dahlia, could you share some of the ways you've incorporated these metrics in your engineering teams?
Yeah, actually, I love the way Nathan you laid it out, where like space is a framework, and I agree with you. Being able to measure these different dimension helps the team a lot. So I love a lot of the things that Dora identifies because I think of them as debugging metrics. They're really about uncovering what might create friction or what gets in the way of the team working. So I would say some of my favorites is cycle time. Cycle time is probably my all-time favorite debugging metric because it helps you uncover the flow of the team. What is really slowing things down or getting in the way of them really delivering the results that they want to deliver. I think most developers and most engineers are out to like make something. I think at one point we talked about creativity, and that's really it. Our discipline is full of being able to create really, really awesome products. So cycle time, I would say, is definitely one that we've dove into. I've measured it across different stages. So I've actually been able with cycle time to determine how the review cycle, because our team was globally distributed at the time, and time zones do factor in. So when you get one comment, wait 12 hours and get another comment, that's quite a lag or it adds to your cycle time of the work. So the team was able to dig into this and figure out how can we improve our review process so that we're getting feedback and turning these changes around much more quickly. Another one is release and deploy frequency. This one is my favorite because oftentimes I somewhat have to convince people that if you deploy more, it'll get easier. So like the scary thing of like, no, let's just wait to one day and we're gonna release all of this at once. Is like, no, we're going to release every change. And I think at the beginning it sounds so daunting, but when you do it, you realize that now you're really investing in smoothing that path so that change can go out quickly. You're doing change at a these are much smaller changes that recover really quickly. So those are probably the two that come to mind as some of my favorite.
Nathan, do you have a favorite by any chance?
I don't know that I have a favorite, but I love Dahlia's approach there. I think that, this whole idea, and one of the things that Dora has learned over the years and now has data to back up is that the way to improve those software delivery performance metrics is to
Mhm.
ship smaller changes, right? And shipping smaller changes is a risk mitigation strategy, right? A smaller change is it's less risky, it's easier to reason
Mhm.
about. If something goes wrong, it's likely to impact fewer people. And even outside of that, it's easier to reason about so that we can roll it back or push forward a hot fix. Like it just leads to so many things. But also, like Dahlia, like you said, it can be scary, I don't want to push out everything all the time because deployments are really painful. Like we have to come in at 2 a.m. on a Friday morning in order to ship those, or a Saturday morning to ship those. Yeah, let's not do that anymore. Let's figure out how do we make the system, which includes you and I, right? How do we make the system safer so that we can operate and do deployments all the time, make
Mhm.
them non-issues, eliminate the drama around deployments.
Right. I think the first thing that comes to mind based on the two things that you guys have been discussing is it makes me question some of the past teams that I've led where we did deployments every Tuesday, for example. Like, was that
Mhm.
the right approach? Should we have been doing them more iteratively throughout the week, or was that right for the team that we were on because of whatever, because of like it was coincided with like, our partner team's releases or something, or it didn't, and we wanted to stagger them throughout the week. Anyways, it's really interesting to take it from that perspective. I'm going to go to our next question, if that's okay. Nathan, since you collaborate with so many teams, how do you start conversations about measuring team performance? What's your approach to making it a productive discussion? And selfishly, I'd really like to hear your perspective on this because I do not do this in practice, but I can already think of so many ways that I should be. For example, the PR review time. It's so long. It takes so long,
Mhm.
and I'm sure there's something I could do to make it better.
Well, I think you've hit the nail right on the head in the question itself. How do you approach it to make it a productive discussion? Look, the reason that we have metrics is so that we can drive change. We use the metrics to kind of get a sense on where and how we're doing right now. If you look at, like Dahlia said, cycle time, or like you're talking about PR review time, like that gives us a number. We can't tell by looking at that number if it's good or bad. We can experience it and say, boy, that feels like it's longer than it needs to be. Great. Now let's have a discussion around why is that so long? And so I really do believe that metrics are there to give us that signal so that we can take action. And that action starts with a conversation. And so, to that end, the way that I collaborate with teams and the way that I show up with teams, first we have to like set very high level expectations. Like, what do you mean when you talk about measuring performance? Like, why would you even want to? What are the immediate pains that you're feeling that's brought you to the conclusion that we need to start measuring our performance, right? And there's always something, right? Sometimes it's just a CTO that's curious or a CEO that's curious, like, how do we get more productivity out of these teams? But sometimes there are other factors as well. So once we understand why we're measuring, then I really want to understand, like, all right, let's map out the process. Sometimes we do you call this value stream mapping or process mapping, where you look at, all right, well, let's look at a portion of the process. Typically with Dora, we look at that software delivery process. So we start at a code commit and we end at the code lands in production. And we try to map out every stage and phase across that with every handoff. And to be clear, you don't need precise data at this point, right? You need to understand the steps and the handoffs and the teams involved. And importantly, it's best to have representation from as many of those teams that are involved as possible. Because I can't tell you the number of times that I've been in a room where we've brought cross-functional team together and team A does XYZ with the code, and then they hand it off to team B, who, as it turns out, does XYZ with the code because they didn't know that team A did that. Like there's a bunch of repetition and waste in that process that has never been visible. And just by making it visible and having those conversations, you immediately start to find places where you can improve. And just like you mentioned, Lima, with the PR reviews with a globally distributed team, you're sitting and waiting a long time for that next team to wake up
Absolutely.
and do that code review. And that there are some just immediate improvement opportunities there. And then frankly,
Right.
like usually if you ask a team, all right, for this application or service, what's bad about it? What would you improve if you could improve anything tomorrow? What would it be? Usually the team knows. The team has really good insights because they're living it every single day.
That's really profound that you just said that because the first thing that came to mind was as should I go identify and do all this analysis and then present it to the engineering organization and be like, hey, this is where we have pain points, or should we ask the team first? Like, what's the best way to approach it from the top down or bottom up or in the middle somewhere, you know?
Yeah, those practitioners live it every day. They know what's wrong. So
True.
your job, I think, as a leader is to understand like what incentives or conditions are there that are keeping them with the status quo and not
Mhm.
allowing them to push against it. And your job as a leader is to create that space for them to push against the status quo.
So well said. I'm going to pivot to our next question. Dahlia, who are these metrics really for? Let's break it down. Who benefits from them and how?
So maybe contrarian or like um I I've had a lot of conversation where oftentimes these are driven by a stakeholder who wants to understand, how do I get more out of the team or what's slowing things down and so on. But in practice, really the most empowering thing is to build this for the team. This is I put it together in a dashboard. It's very tailored for we call our development team pods here, and it's very empowering because each of those pods has different stacks maybe or different ways of working. And to Nathan's point, you want to understand how the team works and you want to empower and enable them to get visibility over these different investments and stages and what gets in the way. They do know it, but I also like um not necessarily I'm surprised, but like I'm always delighted to see how the metrics can bring a story together. So it kind of helps
Totally.
them also speak to how they feel about it so that it's not just my gut feel says this. It's like, no, we're, not able to ship as frequently as we would like to, or our cycle time is measured in days instead of hours. Let's talk about how might we improve it. But really, when you start with metrics and the audience is the team and the engineers, I think it creates a really, really empowering and safe space for you to benefit from measuring and gaining visibility. And then the nice thing also is that now the team is able to translate that conversation to the stakeholders and have more productive ways of saying, hey, we are trying to focus on these initiatives in order to build product faster or improve our quality, or we're having a lot of incidents, so we need to really deal with some of that change failures that we're having and so on. So really, my recommendation is focus on number one audience being the team and go from there.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And there was something that you said where it's like we have a feeling, and these metrics give us like the ground truth data that like supports that feeling. And you're so right on the narrative aspect. There could be like a really great narrative from the first time you're measuring these metrics to like at the end of the year once you've made so much progress. And you made so many good points. So the last one I want to reemphasize is all of this really is a like conduit for the product, right? Engineering enables the product, and the better we are at, the way we do engineering, ideally, the better the product would be. I do want to get one of the questions in the Q&A because there are actually a lot of really good ones. There's one super related to this in that, do you deliver separate metrics to the team versus executive stakeholders? Like, or are there, would you sort out what sort of differences are there between the executive metrics that you would share and the team level, or would they be the same?
So for me, it's not necessarily that they're different. So our dashboards are open to everyone at the company, so
Mm.
anyone could get visibility to it. I structure it. What I love about what Nathan said earlier on the call with the space framework is that you have all these dimensions, and that's kind of how I think of it. So it's more of creating layers where really as you get deeper in the dashboard, you have more of these debugging metrics that can help you answer the specific questions. But really, the stakeholder visibility tends to be outcome driven because I do believe, to your point, we're here to deliver results, build great products, and so on. So that really creates a really healthy interface because ultimately you want to represent how the quality of the work is or how you're able to build these products in a really great way with the team. Nathan, I don't know if you have something to add to this or you have a different method that you like.
Yeah, I would say plus one to that. And one of the things that Dora has shown over the decade or so that we've been doing this research is that better software delivery performance leads to better business outcomes, revenue, profit, customer satisfaction, and so forth. But Dora is a research program that looks broadly across the industry at organizations of every shape and size. So the thing that I encourage teams to do is to take a leap of faith with our research, but then prove it out in your own context, right? And so when it comes to looking at those metrics, your CEO should never care about how many deployments did you make to this application across a year. They absolutely care though about what business value was created. How did your customers, recognize those changes and so forth? What value did it provide to them? At the same time, your engineers should also care about that. What value are we delivering? How are we measuring value at an organizational level? And so putting those two metrics side by side and showing that as we improve software delivery performance, we are also improving organizational outcomes. That's the thing that you want to do. And so as you go up the chain to other stakeholders, I think it's much more important to show change over time, right? Dora's tagline is get better at getting better. We want to help teams drive this idea and practice of continuous improvement. So I don't want to report necessarily the sort of the raw numbers. Rather, I want to report up what's the change over time. These teams are all improving. This particular team maybe is slowing down on their software delivery performance, or they're faltering a little bit. Let's look at investing in that team, or investigating what countermeasures or so forth could we put in place to help them. I guess one other quick thing I want to caution teams on, and this is really hard because look, we're engineers, and engineers live in a world of precision. You don't necessarily need a lot of precision for most of these metrics. The team understands how they're doing. We like again, just using some of the real world use cases. You want to build a dashboard of deployment frequency. Well, this application deploys 4 times a year. You don't need a dashboard for that. You need like a hand with most of the fingers on it. You can count that. You don't need a dashboard for that. 4 times a year, you're precise enough just in a conversation. So just be very careful about, and I caution because sometimes I've seen overinvestment in improving the precision without acting on those signals at all. And again, the reason that we have these signals in these metrics is to drive change. So let's drive that improvement.
I think that's fascinating, especially the precision aspect. It's a good point. It's a super good point. I'm going to pivot to our next question because this is super familiar, as in it's anchored on my real life experiences. So selfishly, I'd love to hear Nathan and Dahlia's thoughts on this. So teams often work in very different contexts. For example, some teams focus on operational systems like maintaining a critical backend service, like let's say to the front door of home, while others are more product focused, working on new features with fewer operational demands, and they kind of rely on this other team for, ensuring that the backend services are, performing as expected, serving their number of requests correctly as we expect it. So given that like different teams have different responsibilities and different contexts that they work in, do you all think that these teams need different metrics? How do you handle that in practice? Nathan, you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the first like caution I'll give is just be careful of the othering that's happening in the question. Both that back end service and the front end service are there to serve the customer, right? And so understanding what's the customer journey, or the critical user journey, we sometimes call these, right? What's the critical user journey that my application or the work that I'm doing is in support of, and truly understanding that, and understanding what does that look like when it's good? Or maybe more importantly, what does that look like when it's bad? So that I can make sure that I'm building in the right reliability, the right capabilities, and so forth into the application itself. And we have to have that joint ownership. So when there is a separation of ownership, that's fine. We have to have our incentives aligned, and our understanding of the problem that we're solving has to be aligned. And then given that, of course, you're going to have different metrics, and you should expect different results from those metrics. Even if you stick with those 4 basic software delivery performance metrics, the backend team is necessarily going to have a different, raw numbers, different actuals than the front end team. That's okay. Again, what we care about is how are those changing over time? Are they both improving? That's great. Are they both deteriorating? That's something where we might want to intervene.
I think there's a question in our Q&A that kind of jives with this, if you don't mind me like adding it in. Patrick asked, how do you address teams being measured on activities they do not feel they have autonomy over? So for example, being asked to increase deployment frequency despite having to hand off to an external team like a CM for deployments. I'm not sure what CM stands for, but change management, I don't know.
Yeah,
Do you
probably a
have
change
that?
management.
Mm.
My first piece of advice is go have coffee with the change management team. Like, the reason that you feel like you have no autonomy, like you have no control over that, like that's kind of an excuse. Like, you might need some leadership support to help get alignment across those two teams, but also you probably have a misunderstanding of why they only deploy every month or whatever the case may be, and they have a misunderstanding of why you want to deploy every single day, like like, and you're both wrong about the other. So you've got to build up that empathy and come together and talk to one another, and then from a like beyond just go get coffee with them and get to know them as another human that's on the same mission as you. The other thing that you might end up considering, if you're the product team and you're frustrated because your deploys don't go out as frequently as you want, dig in and maybe give some of that product engineering capacity to that deployment team to help streamline, automate, whatever it is to unblock them. Show that partnership, and then you're like building that partnership and achieving the goal that you want. Dahlia, what do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think oftentimes that's exactly it. Approaching the challenge with curiosity is a really good way to uncover it. Also, understanding from a stakeholder, why are you being asked to measure that, could give you insight into what do they care about. So like again, that I love the framing of debugging, because that's kind of, if you approach it with that level of curiosity, you will hopefully get to the objective that you're truly aiming for, or like what really matters to focus on, as opposed to being really tied into an output that is just measuring activity but doesn't really get you anywhere. And that's oftentimes what you're trying to avoid, is some form of busy work that really doesn't deliver or impact the results of the team.
Makes sense. So insightful. And I like, so again, selfishly picked Patrick's question because it's so relatable to me as a team that owns one of the primary backend services that serve home. It's the same thing. It's like, why can't we deliver these features quicker? And I think that whole coffee analogy and like both understanding each other's roles and how we can support each other is a really big aspect of this. It also makes me realize we should just have office hours. You two should have office hours, and I just bring my problems to you all. Like thumbs up, because that it's spot on. I'm gonna go to our next question. Dahlia, this one's for you. There's a real human element when talking about team performance. It's not the same as revenue metrics or click-through rate like we use in A/B tests. How do we account for human factors like collaboration or team dynamics that are ultimately influence team performance? Are there metrics for that?
Yeah, so for me, like some of the principles of building these metrics, and related to this question specifically, is that I look for team metrics, not individual metrics. So when we talk about, a number of these different ways that you measure how the work is being done, I factor in that I'm measuring a team working together, and that's really the beauty of it. So one of the ways that I describe, this form of team, and I didn't come up with this, it's not, my necessarily a reference, but I really love it for the representation of it, is that it's not a golf team that you're measuring where every player is sort of playing their round and then you're tallying the scores. You really are looking at a soccer team or a basketball team. Each player plays a different position, but you need them to come together to play a really, really strong game. And that's why I prefer not to bring those metrics at the individual level. There are times when you want to have performance conversations, or you see someone struggling, and you just have to be careful to not make those metrics punitive or really create a stress that will undo the positive of having data and measurements for the team. So really, like, to me, it's about, follow the incentive, really encourage that collaboration, And remember that each of those players comes with their own strength, and they will spend, more time or less time in certain activities, but it all needs to come together to support the work the team is delivering.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Especially it could, if we were to focus on like the individuals, it really would undo the power that you could get from the data and the metrics and making things better. I totally agree. Nathan, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. When it comes to the like Dora's research, most of our questions that we ask, and certainly those four software delivery metrics, are meant at the level of an application or service. So we ask for the primary application or service that you work on, how frequently do you deploy that application to production, right? And at the application or service level, you're actually transcending teams potentially, depending on the organization, right? Because that is a cross-functional team that's responsible for that. And we also ask, some of those operational performance metrics or those stability metrics. The pitfall to avoid there is taking those four metrics and trying to divide them up across different teams, right? Developers, you're responsible for like that change lead time. Operators, you're responsible for that change failure rate. When you do that, like we've set up incentives where we're fighting against each other. As an operator, I know the best way to keep my system stable is to accept no changes. Now we both lose, right? So that's not good. We have to share those incentives. We have to share those metrics across those cross-functional teams. At the same time, it doesn't make sense to ask how frequently does Spotify deploy to production? That doesn't give you, I mean, it's I'm sure a very large number, but it's not giving you any good signal that you can act on.
Absolutely. And the number's pretty high. So like, I don't know. We're past that type of problem. All right, I'm going to go to the next question. Nathan, this one's for you. The thing about productivity metrics, you could have the best, it's similar. You could have the best engineers, but they could be in a situation where their partner teams are hard to collaborate with. How do you factor in challenges like cross-team collaboration when using metrics? Dahlia, I feel like you also have some good perspective on here on this. But Nathan, let's start with you.
Okay, sure. I think this goes back to the earlier question that we had, about those teams and bringing them together for coffee, maybe providing some engineering capacity to another team, and remembering that like this gets down to a question really of around alignment and incentives, right? If you're a developer and you're incentivized to write as much code as possible, and then you're a QA engineer and you're incentivized to find as many bugs as possible, and you're an operator and your incentive is to keep the systems as stable as possible, like we are all three now working at odds to one another, right? As the developer, my job is to write the bugs. As a QA engineer, my job is to find the bugs. As an operator, my job is to not accept any changes. Like that's bad. So I think it really does come down to getting that alignment and the incentives correct and building that empathy across the different roles.
Absolutely. Dahlia, before you jump in, you said something about incentives. And whenever I think of the word incentives, my brain thinks about the word leverage. It can we get leverage with these metrics? Does that create leverage for specific teams? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that kind of like sometimes the pitfall is that with all best intentions, leaders create org structures or incentives or misaligned sort of reward system that starts to fragment the focus of the team or starts to create a lot of this anxiety around, well, yeah, I mean, Nathan, you're right. The most stable system is the one that you don't change at all. But that's really not what most teams or most engineers want to do. They want to create something and they want to do it safely and in a way that, rewards that like the product's getting used and you're growing and so on. So I really think it's not about applying metrics just as here are the four Dora metrics, just implement them as is. You really need to do the legwork and understand how does the team work? What are we aiming to do? What are objectives? One of the conversations I love with each of our development teams is really identifying their product objective because that becomes their North Star and what they're aiming to do. And then you can really start to see, okay, as we're doing the work, what's getting in the way? How can we make things better? What is consuming a lot of our capacity, but really not leading to any or as much value as we want? And then, empowering the team in this case to prioritize some of that work or take some of their capacity to address it, because that's also the other thing that I've seen where there's so much focus on shipping product that sometimes you forget that, oh yeah, your manager and your CEO will support you prioritizing this engineering initiative, because they recognize that you're wasting a lot of time battling with a system that's not working with you. So I think hopefully metrics allow those conversations to happen so that you can feel empowered to prioritize that work as well.
Yeah, I would just like taking it back to space. We have that C for communication and collaboration. Like that is a measure for a reason. And then bringing that back to some of the DORA research, some of the things that we've found, like one of the biggest bottlenecks that we found in large enterprises is your change approval process. Sometimes, there's a change approval board that all changes have to go to get approved. And as it turns out, that slows you down. Not surprising. But what our research also shows is that it actually increases risk. So your change failure rate is likely to be higher if you have a heavyweight change approval process. Oh, but it gets worse. It also drives a lot of burnout on the team because one of the ways that you can identify burnout is as an employee, are you able to disconnect from work? And when you have a heavyweight, sort of opaque change approval process, as an engineer, I don't know what it's going to take to get this change approved. I think I'm done with it, but I might go home thinking about and stressed about, like, is it going to, like, that change approval board is happening on Tuesday? Is my change going to get approved, or am I going to have to rework that? Like, all of that can contribute to burnout. And so again, identifying that's communication and collaboration that's happening or not across teams. That's an important factor.
Absolutely. I used to work at a company years and years ago that had a daily change control board. And I got to the point as an engineer, this is before I switched to leadership, that I just started pushing without telling because it was awful. Like I didn't want to get a VP that really was far away from my work to approve my change, which I felt like wouldn't get approved. It would get pushed to later in the week. And it only was because like they were not as familiar with my change. It's a totally agree with everything that you just said, both of you. Um, all right, I'm going to go to the next question. Um, Talia, sometimes a metric looks great on paper but doesn't lead to a meaningful change. Can you share an example of a metric that didn't work out as planned and what you may have learned from it?
So the one in a lot of conversation, and I think it'd be amiss not to mention it, is lines of code. I am not a fan. I can understand maybe some of the reasoning, but really in practice or in the way that we truly work, it doesn't really lead to uncovering or being able to get the results that you're looking for. Another one that I've seen sometimes looks like it could be helpful is tallying story points and seeing, can we do more story points? Well, that's also not a great measure as well in practice. So I think it's okay to try different things, but like grounding it in a practice that is healthy, that is not quantity based only, that measure things from both ends. So like if you're shipping a lot, but like it's introducing a ton of bugs and you have incidents, that's not really a well balanced output, if you will. So those are some of the ones that come to mind. Nathan, do you want to throw more of what you hate or what's not a great metric here?
Yeah, I think there are others that are along that same vein of like story points or lines of code. There's a little bit of like flurry in the sort of echo chamber of social media recently around this idea of ghost engineers as measured by like, oh, they haven't done any pull requests in a quarter, so clearly they're not doing any work, right? So number of pull requests can actually be a harmful metric as well. Actually, on that topic, like any of these metrics could end up being used in a harmful way. And so I think it is really important that as you're introducing new metrics, that you think very critically about how could this, like, what harm could this metric introduce? What behaviors are we incentivizing now with this metric that could potentially lead to harmful outcomes or harmful impacts? And the truth is, you probably don't actually know until you've put that metric in place. So I saw a question in the QA earlier about when do you know that it's time to get rid of a metric, like to stop asking or stop measuring that thing. Well, the minute you see that it's causing harm, you should definitely drop it. Or if I would argue that if you're capturing a signal and you're ignoring that signal or not changing something because of it, there's a higher likelihood that it's going to cause harm than it's going to be good. And that's a metric that you should stop reporting, maybe even stop collecting.
Makes total sense. I think great answers from both of you. Thank you. I'll go to our next question. We often talk about what to measure, but how do you approach communicating these metrics back to your team? How do you ensure metrics are motivating rather than discouraging or overly scrutinizing? Nathan, do we want to start off?
Yeah, I think this again comes down to some of the things that Dahlia was talking about earlier. These metrics are for the team to help them identify and drive improvements. That's sort of the platonic ideal. But everyone on your team, when you come to them and want to introduce new metrics or a new metrics framework, they're going to have a reaction to that. And that reaction is really largely based on the culture of your organization. Is this organization an organization where it's safe to fail? Is it an organization where we're prioritizing learning? If those things aren't the case, then people are going to be very skeptical and probably afraid of metrics. When you use metrics to identify individual level performance as opposed to more of a team or system level performance, that's when they get even scarier. And so you have to be very, very careful about how you roll them out and how you introduce them. And the best way to do that, I think there's two things I would offer. One, start small. Don't introduce a new metric or a new framework to the entire organization. Start with one or two teams, put it into practice, see how that works for you and those teams before you start rolling it out wider. And then the second thing is that the only way to sort of appease those fears or ease those fears that people have about new metrics is through your actions, right? You can't talk your way out of getting them afraid. They have to see that commitment over time. Look, these metrics went down and nothing bad happened to anyone on the team. No one got fired because of it, but instead we got given more capacity to fix the things that were causing that metric to deteriorate. That's a net win for everybody. That's the behavior that you want to encourage.
Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it then gives the team leverage to then make what it entails of being an engineer and like all the things related to like deployments. I think it makes their job ideally better at the end, or at least more enjoyable. Sorry, Dahlia, did you have thoughts too?
Oh, no problem at all. I think to add to Nathan, like agree with everything, and I just Nathan mentioned this a few times as well in other answers, but the trend really matters more than the raw number. I would also encourage not comparing teams. Individual like teams are composed of individuals. Individuals are unique, and comparing one team to another is just super discouraging and is not really practical or doesn't lead to really a lot of value. So keeping that in mind, that if you are approaching it to really help the team solve problems for themselves, it's not tremendously valuable to compare one to the other and say this team is doing so much better because you're putting out this many PRs every week.
Absolutely. If you can't get over that, like, because there are so many places I work with that they just can't get over that, but we have to be able to compare teams. Then what I recommend that you do is you compare the trends, right? So Team A has improved 5% over the last quarter. Team B has improved 10% over the last quarter. Turns out Team B has deployed way fewer than Team A, but they've improved a lot more. Let's reward that team. That's the thing that we want to reward, is that improvement, and then take the lessons from that and see how can we spread those across the organization. And in addition to teams being made up of individuals, and like we all have our own squishy context and motivations and so forth, like each application that we're building is targeting a different use case or a different set of users who also turns out are people. Or maybe it's an API, so it's in a computer, but eventually it touches a person, right? But they all have different motivations and risk tolerance levels and goals, et cetera, et cetera. So it is very complex. This is why we oftentimes talk about this as a creative endeavor. It's a creative, complex, sort of emergent space that we're working in. We can't control it by clamping down. We have to let the emergent properties emerge.
I think that was the perfect way to end this. from you, both of you closed this out so well. It is a creative process. Emphasizing trends, not raw numbers, is the perfect place to end. So with that, I like to say thank you all for such an insightful conversation. I think it was great. I learned so much. I really appreciate both of your time and everyone else who came and watched. We'll be heading over now to the Lead Dev Slack in the hashtag Engineering Velocity channel. Please head over there to continue discussion. There's a lot of more questions that we need to answer. Thank you.